Well, good evening. How's everybody doing? It's exciting times for us. Yes. Well, I've been given the opportunity to speak to you all about challenges in American politics. And so there are a number of challenges that we could talk about, but you guys gave me the privilege of choosing my own topic on the challenges in American politics. So I decided to choose the one that I've worked on for the last 6 years, which is the challenge of opportunity. I want to share my personal story and why the opportunity agenda has been my focus for my entire 6 years in the United States Senate. I started as a kid, poor kid in South Carolina. North Charleston was where I was born. And my mother's with us back there in the back taking pictures. Wave at everybody, Mom. Yeah. Bring your own audience with you when you can. So growing up in a single-parent household was not nearly as much fun as fun is, but by the time I was 7 years old, my parents had divorced. We had moved back to South Carolina from Michigan. From 7 to about 14 years old, I basically drifted. How many of you all know that drifting typically leads in the wrong direction? Yeah. Only about 7, but this is okay. So at 14 years old, the 7 years of drifting had accumulated on my academic record. So as a freshman in high school, I flunked out of high school. I think I'm the first United States senator to ever fail out of high school. I failed world geography and civics, civics being the study of politics. I say the Creator has an amazing sense of humor. I also failed Spanish and English. Now, when you fail Spanish and English, no one calls you bilingual. Nobody. They all call you bi-ignorant because you can't speak in any language. That's where I found my unhappy self. I had 2 major blessings, though. A mother who believed in prayer and who believed in encouraging her child. So she would tell me all the time that if you just shoot for the moon and you miss, you'll be among the stars. It's an old saying that's been repeated thousands and thousands of times by millions and millions of parents. And my mother believed it, so she would continue to tell me that. My entire freshman year in high school, she would say, son, if you just shoot for the moon and you miss, you'll be among the stars. I will concede that somewhere around the 70th or 80th time, the third 6 weeks when I was not doing better, she started to say, if you just shoot for the moon and you miss, you'll be among the stars. So I'm not sure that she believed it every time she said it, but she did it. She believed it the first 100 times she said it. And so by the end of my freshman year, I was going the wrong direction. I had the good fortune of meeting a mentor shortly thereafter. But my mother took me outside. I know this is not going to be popular in this room, but my mother took me outside that last 6 weeks, and she walked me outside. It was night because she worked 16 hours a day. She was a nurse's aide, so she basically had the lowest job in a hospital other than the folks who were cleaning the rooms. She would take patients and turn them over and take bedpans out and then flip them back over. So she didn't have a glorious job in the hospital. She was working 16 hours a day, trying to keep us off of welfare, trying to show us that there's dignity in all work. Do all that you can where you are and keep doing it as long as you can. So she walks me outside. It's 11:30 at night. She's coming home from work and she's like, son, you remember? I said, yes, ma'am, I know the story. Y'all know the story. you weren't even there, you already know the story. I said, shoot for the moon and you'll miss, you'll be among the stars. She's like, no, let me teach you another lesson. So she took me over to a tree. Anyone here from the South? So she taught me a lesson. It was called the psychology of a switch. A switch is a southern apparatus of encouragement. It is applied from your belt to your ankles. And she loved me back into the right lane. The second thing that happened was I met a mentor. I was my sophomore year. So I went to summer school, caught up with my class, and graduated on time, which was a blessing. I learned very quickly that studying was as important as athletics. One of the reasons why I was so grounded in athletics was I thought that the only way for a poor kid at that time, particularly an African-American kid, to escape poverty was either entertainment. You've heard my best jokes. It does not get any better than this. Point well made. Athletics or like music wasn't going to happen for me. So I had to focus on education. Second thing that happened, that the mentor that came along my sophomore year was a guy named John Moniz, who was the Chick-fil-A operator, who really said that you can think your way out of poverty. Now, he said that specifically for me, not that people in poverty are not thinking, but that looking at my academic performance, understanding and appreciating the journey I had been on, that I was not applying myself academically. And that he wanted me to understand and appreciate that in America, all things were still possible, even for poor kids. He would say that anyone from anywhere at any time could succeed beyond their wildest imagination. I did not believe him, to be honest with you. And so it took 3 or 4 years for him to convince me that all things were truly possible, even for me, from where I was coming from. And that turned out to be true. So I earned a small football scholarship to a college called Presbyterian College in the upper part of South Carolina, and my life changed drastically. I started realizing the lessons that John Moniz was teaching me for the last 4 years of my life were actually facts that I needed to hold on to. Unfortunate for me, at 19 years old, my mentor was 38 years old, he died. He went into hospital for a simple kind of procedure, and found himself unable to recover from what they said was a poor dose of a medicine. So at 38 years old, he was gone. His life's mission was to positively impact the lives of 1 million people with a message of hope and opportunity. In response to his death, the day before his funeral, I decided to set my life's mission work as to positively impact the lives of 1 billion people with a message of hope and opportunity. Opportunity has a lot to do with financial independence or financial literacy. And John just taught me some really cool lessons that today I laugh at because they're so simple, but yet profound. One of the lessons he taught me was that having a job is a good thing. But creating jobs is a better thing, which really, through time, having become a small business owner, having started 2 or 3 companies, I now realize the difference between the two and the significant impact you can have within your community if you want to change your community, be in a position to hire the folks within your community as opposed to just having a job. The second thing he taught me was the importance of income versus profit. This took a little longer for me to understand and appreciate. I thought having a big income was the key to success. He taught me that your income is how you establish your lifestyle. Your profit is how you create wealth. And that lesson has stuck with me and made me giggle, truly, just laugh out loud sometimes because of how profound that simple lesson was. And so let's fast forward through I got elected early in my late 20s to the county government, county council. I spent 13 years on that, 2 years in the State House, 2 years in Congress, appointed to the Senate, ran for election in 2014, won that election, ran again in 2016, won that election for a 6-year term. Along the way, I started some businesses. Some of you may have already done some homework, but started a few all-state insurance agencies, a real estate company, as you said during the introduction, a janitorial cleaning company, and some other little small gigs. I could not keep a job, so you keep finding a way to create jobs. This is important as well. So fast forward into my political career. I created the opportunity agenda really to try to find a way to thread the needle of pain and misery of my own past and hope and opportunity, lessons taught to me by my mother and my mentor. And so I wanted to thread that needle to find a way to create opportunities where there were none. And so for me, the Opportunity Agenda was born in 2013, my first year in the Senate, and the Opportunity Agenda focused on 3 things that I believe will help significantly with the conflict and the challenges that we have in American politics and frankly in American society. The first one, the foundation of it has to be education. I think education is key. My nephew, so every generation in the Scott family, we have scrapped and scraped and figured a way forward. My nephew is like the star of the show. I don't have any kids, so he's like half my kid, half my brother's kid. And literally, here's a guy who's better looking than I am. It's hard to believe, I understand that. That ain't that funny, by the way, so y'all are laughing way too hard. Second, he's a lot smarter than I. He went to Georgia Tech for his undergrad, Duke for his master's. He spent a semester here in Oxford, the summer semester in Oxford. And then finally, he's now in medical school at Emory. But the one thing I will say about the foundation of education for our nation is, if you don't have a good K through 12, it's hard to make up the rest of the road. My nephew went to a magnet school for science, for STEM. And when he arrived at Georgia Tech, he was shocked at how far behind he was, even though he was at a STEM school in a poor county. And so the access to opportunities throughout the education system, it ain't or isn't a level playing field. And so we've been talking about that for a number of years. And part of my opportunity agenda is trying to focus on how to create high quality education in every single zip code in America. We use as a part of our national strategy the Success Academies in New York City. I'm not sure if you're familiar with those, but Eva Moskowitz, the guy behind you, by the way, he was grilling me earlier. So, Spencer, right? Yes. So Eva's done a great job with these amazing charter schools, public charter schools, where 87% of the population is minority, the black and brown. I think it's 91% are on free lunch, average income under $30,000 in New York City. And one of her 41 high schools are in the top 5 in science, in math, and in English in the state of New York. Just outstanding performance because she's committed to the concept that every child can learn. All you actually need is the right environment to make sure that happens. The second thing is workforce development. Too many of our kids finish high school and never go beyond. So I'm not sure that, I think in America we have an addiction to the 4-year degree. I'm not quite sure that is the only path out. I actually think that trade is a great way out. Technical schools is a wonderful way out. Apprenticeship programs, Germany's got their foot on the pedal and it works just marvelously. We should be doing more apprenticeship programs in America as well. But that workforce development space is an area where I believe if we were to dedicate more of our time and energy from the public forum, we would actually find ourselves seeing a lot of success manifest through workforce development areas of apprenticeship programs specifically. Third area is I call the GO part of my opportunity agenda, which is the growth and opportunity. It takes the right soil conditions for prosperity to sprout throughout our country. My perspective is, God bless you, one of the ways that you create those soil conditions is through your tax environment and your regulatory state. Those two combined together can in fact create an amazing opportunity throughout the country. I think we've seen that in the last 18 months. I hope we see it for years to come. What we've done through the tax reform that we just passed, which is, in my opinion, the manifestation of that pain and misery, as I talked about earlier, and the hope and opportunity being fused together. In the tax reform that we passed in 2017, December, one of the things we did is we lowered the average tax burden on a single-parent household by 73%. We lowered the tax burden, federal tax burden, within a two-parent household by about 63%. So we were able to put more money in the pockets of 90% of W-2 wage earners in America. Part of the tax reform bill was my signature legislation called the Opportunity Zones. Opportunity Zones was designed to attract more capital in those distressed communities where I've come out from so that we would do more good there. We are hoping, and according to the Secretary of Treasury, we should have about $100 billion descending upon those distressed communities to create a real renaissance in those communities. I'm excited about it. I've been meeting with folks. Interesting concept is, anybody recognize that there's not a lot of bipartisanship in American politics? You have recognized that? What's your name?
I'm Ryan.
Ryan, you're paying close attention. This is good news, right? So you got to be really, it's like you're paying close attention, right? So this is an area where, unbeknownst to me, people are flocking to the Opportunity Zone legislation to figure out how to do good work. Some are flocking there for pure profit because there's a major incentive to make a profit in those areas. Others are flocking because they are conscientious capitalists, and those are the folks that I'm targeting. I've said very clearly, if this legislation only creates more profit for those who already have lots of profits, I'm going to cancel the legislation. But if we can do good and make a good return, I'm all for that. So the other day, anybody here listen to music? So what do you listen to, man? No, I guess just talking. So Ryan, I had a dinner 2 nights last Wednesday with a guy named T.I., who's a rapper. Anybody heard of T.I.? He goes by Tip, though. I'm not sure why is it Tip. There's just a T and an I, but he says, my name's Tip. It's like, okay, cool. And there's another guy named, you may know, Charlemagne the God, who is kind of a left-leaning guy, a little left. Way left. And so I did this big conference on opportunity zones, and they both showed up. I was like, what are you doing here? What did I do wrong? And we had this great conversation, and we all stereotype people who are not like ourselves. There's an in group, there's an out group. I learned very quickly that people are passionate about changing the communities that they're from. And T.I. perhaps had one of the best points I had ever heard. He said, why ought I not go back to where I'm from and reinvest all the money I'm making to buy houses and create development and then to create jobs so that I create an ecosystem that fuels the next great, you fill in your own blank, whether it's an athlete, entertainer, actor, or scientist. And so he's doing a lot of work in Atlanta to help see this resurgence or this renaissance happen. The Opportunity Zone legislation, I'll go through the details at another point. We've got about 4 minutes left before she tells me to sit down, and I believe she will, actually. So that has been a significant piece of legislation that's already having a positive impact in the communities that I had targeted. As an example, the property values in the Opportunity Zones are up about 20%. The good news is about 56% of the people who live in Opportunity Zones own their own property. They own their own homes. So the fear of gentrification, which would be the natural next question if you're attracting a lot of capital, only 4% of Opportunity Zones, there are 8,700 of them throughout America, only 4% have any signs of gentrification whatsoever. So far, so good. 8% wage increase within the Opportunity Zone because we're putting pressure in those areas that by attracting more capital, more jobs, we're seeing the wages increase. Final thing I'll say on the success of this opportunity agenda approach to transforming lives in distressed areas. If you look at the outcome of where we are from a financial perspective, we're in a pretty good place. Our unemployment rate is at 3.6%, 50-year low here. In the UK, it's 4.3%, which is a fantastic rate as well, without any question. The African American unemployment rate is around 6.7 in April. It has been the lowest it's ever been in America because of tax reform and the regulatory reset. Hispanic unemployment rate, under 6% right now, lowest it's ever been in recorded history in America. More women coming back to the workforce in a powerful way since 1969. We're seeing some really cool things happen because of the tax reset and the regulatory reset. Wages are up 3.2% for the last 12 months, which is interesting that the bottom quintile has been struggling to see any actual wage growth. The last quarter, their wage growth was over 4%. And so what we're starting to see is downward pressure that is actually very positive pressure happening in that bottom quintile. And the bottom quintile is a place where there's about $2 trillion of payroll that can be automated today. They could just go away. Good news is when you start seeing the wages increasing and the automation not happening, it's because we're starting to see productivity gains in that bottom quintile, which is incredibly important for what's getting ready to be the greatest disruption in the American economy that we've seen probably 10 years from now, which will be the tech or the gig economy. Is going to be so disruptive, hence the importance of the workforce development plank in my opportunity agenda. If you don't hit that, the 40-year-old and the 50-year-old who still wants to work won't be able to work. So our labor force participation rate, which is around 62%, we need around 67%, is going to struggle for a long time to come. So putting pressure there is critically important for us to make sure that the productivity gains continue if we're going to have a healthy economy. Finally, our estimate for 2018 GDP growth was about 2.6, 2.7. We hit 3.1. First quarter, they said we would be down closer to 2%. We're at 3.2%. There is a possibility of a 4% GDP growth. I'm excited about that because when you think about us having a $22 trillion debt, that's a lot of money, by the way. Your faces look so stoic, like that's not a big deal. You got to pay it, not me. I mean, at least you do, coming back to America. So literally, I thought it was kind of funny too, thank you very much. So literally, the way that we put pressure on eliminating that $22 trillion debt, you have to figure out your entitlement state, and you also have to grow your economy well over 3%. For every half a point that we add to our economic growth, for 0.4% economic growth over 2% adds about $700 billion. So a full point adds somewhere near 1.9, almost $2 trillion that we can use to pay down the debt if we're smart enough not to spend it. I'm not quite sure we're that smart, actually, to be honest with you. We haven't been so far. So we have a spending addiction in Washington, much like we do everywhere in the world. But if we could continue to grow our economy and deal with our entitlement state, we could find ourselves actually reducing that burden on the next generation of taxpayers. So with that, I'll stop there and look forward kind of to your questions.
Senator, thank you very much for your address and for joining us today.
Yes, ma'am.
I wanted to start at the beginning of your career. You mentioned to us that you were involved in business for a while.
Yes.
What activated your desire to want to go into politics? And more specifically, when did you start to think of yourself as a Republican?
Yeah, so what started my desire? I think in high school, I had a teacher who was the kindest, sweetest lady who said, "Tim, you talk too much. You've got to figure something out to do." And she told me to go into student council to get me from talking through her class. And it worked for me. It was a chance for me to have conversations with people and to start advocating on behalf of other students. And so I did that through high school, student government president with the Boys State, which is a program that takes the top 2 students, rising seniors from each high school, to go through a leadership training track and figure out whether or not you have any leadership skills, and add in political science, and a good mentor who taught me that it's better to give than receive. And I put myself in a campaign so I could be a volunteer, and it turned out that I still had the passion for politics. So I said, I was 28 years old, decided that I was going to run for an open seat. And at that point, I had to make a decision on coming out as a Republican or staying the Democrat course. And I will tell you that it was an interesting decision. I'd like to say that it was just an analytical decision, but it really was somewhat of an analysis. Other part of it was just timing. So I went to the Democrat Party because everyone that looked like me was a Democrat. I'm not sure if you are aware, in America, most African Americans vote for Democrats. Oh, you already knew that. Okay, my bad. You're like, is this guy serious or not? I was not serious. And so I went there, and I stood in line for a little while, and the guy came over and said, what are you here to do? I said, I'd like to run for county council. He said, well, you haven't really participated. He said, if you just wait your turn, you can run in a couple of years. I went to the Republican Party, and they said, you sound like one of us, but you don't really look like one of us. I'm not sure what he meant. I'm bald. I've been bald for a long time, so maybe that's what he meant. And he said, but if you want to run, feel free to. You can run, but you'll probably lose because we've never had an African-American Republican before. So I got lucky in my first race, and we won that race. And when I thought about the issues, the strong military, the single-parent households, strong desire for small businesses to succeed and to thrive, the issues that I wanted to advocate on behalf were the issues that the Republican Party at the time was advocating on behalf of. My mentor, the John Moniz guy, who never talked to me about politics, was actually a Republican, a conservative Republican, but he didn't think it was his job to sway me one way or the other. He wanted to teach me a conscientious form of capitalism more than he wanted to teach me a political or partisan philosophy. So that's how I became a Republican, and at least why I ran as a Republican.
And you talk quite a lot about your policy, which is obviously the GOP tax overhaul, which created these opportunity zones.
Yes, ma'am.
You talk quite a lot about the content, but can you talk us through the process? It was obviously quite a difficult one. Yes. How did you achieve that?
Well, the best way to I shouldn't say that. Sometimes the best thing you can do is hide your legislation in a larger bill.
That happens.
And pray that nobody finds it.
That sometimes happens at the union, yeah.
It never happens, really. But I actually did that for about a year, to be honest with you. And I remember sitting on one of my finance committee hearings, and someone said, what's this thing that costs $1.7 billion? I'm like, it's just this thing, don't worry about it so much, We'll talk about it later. And so we had some conversations in the committee on it, and it had enough, there was enough curiosity around the legislation to make it popular. The other thing that helped a lot, to be frank, is that after the Charlottesville incident, if you're familiar with the Charlottesville incident.
You went to Trump.
I went to, President Trump called me and said, see, you're not very happy with my statements on race, and you've been quite critical. Are you willing to come to the White House? And so I went to the Oval Office, and we sat down, we had a chat about race and history, and we did not leave on the same page. And I have said several times, anyone that expects anyone, that's an adult to change their mind in one 30-minute conversation, you just have no clue. But he said, all right, Tim, tell me one way I can be helpful to communities that are distressed, or African-American communities at large. I said, well, I have a piece of legislation called the Investing in Opportunity Act. If you will support that, it will bring more resources back to the distressed communities than anything we've done in 30 years. He's like, okay. He says, I'll take your word and I'll support it. And the next day on Air Force One, he was talking about that thing with the Investing in Opportunity Act, and that helped quell some of the curiosity on the right, which was very important. So the combination between getting it in the tax reform bill, being one of the four folks who was chosen to be one of the four horsemen to design the tax reform package, and then to sell it to the other Republicans and hopefully some Democrats in Congress. So having had that lead role, I was able to put my legislation in there. And then I was also on the conference committee that we worked through the differences between the House bill and the Senate bill to come up with a compromise. And I was able to keep it in there because I was on that committee, so it worked out really well. And then the president signed it into law, and we've had, as I said earlier, a lot of folks who are interested in doing some good within their own communities.
And you've talked about how that bill creates wage increases at every level. When we had Representative Barney Frank come a few weeks ago, he made the point that even if you're richer, that relative inequality can still feel quite painful. What would you say to people that said that your bill, it will make people more rich, but there still will be no decrease in that gap between the rich and the poor?
Well, I'd say that the poverty rate 2 years ago was about 15%. The poverty rate now is about 12.4%. That drop represents a few million households. I would say to those millions of households where they are no longer considered in poverty, it makes a significant measurable difference in a reasonable amount of time. Number one. Number two, I would say that the pressure that we've placed on the bottom quintile, as I was talking about, the pressure of a 4% wage increase at the bottom, that's a significant change that we haven't seen in more than a decade. So it's a really important move in the right direction. I'd also say that 9 out of 10 households, 9 out of 10 W-2, i.e. you work for someone and you don't work for yourself, saw an increase in their take-home pay because of the tax reform bill. So I would say that we were seeing more people with more money in their pockets, which is a big deal because the average person, about 48% of Americans only have about $400 in their emergency fund, which is a big deal if you can get an extra 30 or 40 bucks a paycheck. That could double that emergency fund without taking any money away from the bills or the responsibilities or the obligations that you have. And the tax rates have without question, produced more revenues for the government at the same time. So in February, our revenues to the government was up 15% over last year. So what we've seen is it's worked as an incentive to get more money to the Treasury.
And staying on policy, you've been supportive of movements against minority voter disenfranchisement, which have also been supported by people from the Democratic Party, like Stacey Abrams. You talked about how difficult bipartisan movements are in America and bipartisan politics.
Yes.
Do you ever get frustrated with people in your own party that are reluctant to engage with those kind of movements?
Never.
And do you think they could be more supportive?
Well, no, I was joking. Yeah, I mean, listen, I think we all are sometimes a victim of our own upbringing. Our own paradigm that we see the world through may create blinders at times. And yeah, I would love to have more folks on both sides of the aisle taking seriously the absolutely essential right to vote and to participate fully in the American society. By doing so, I think we reinforce our ethos to people who think that we don't think about them at all. So I think we should take it seriously. And I think we should take it seriously on the right and on the left.
So when you were in South Carolina, you served in the South Carolina Senate, and you were in the Legislative Black Caucus. Why aren't you part of the Congressional Black Caucus?
Probably because I was in the state legislative Black Caucus, to be honest with you. So when I was in the State House, I joined the Congressional Black Caucus, and it was interesting because we'd have these amazing meetings, and a lot of good folks. I work with them now as their senator, who was a part of the Black Caucus at the State House with me. Some of my good friends are still there. But I did realize that we were so disjointed on some topics that it felt like, I'm not saying this is true by the way, but it felt like the meeting after the meeting when I left was more important than the meeting I was in. So I felt like I just saved them the time. No need to have two meetings, I'll just not come. And so for me, I think it's worked out well that I'm a big believer that America's better together, and that sometimes we create these artificial barriers to getting things done. And so I decided consciously not to join the Congressional Black Caucus when I got there. Other African American Republicans have joined and have had a similar experience that I had in the State House. So I do a lot of work with a lot of the members, however. So I do a historically Black college and university fly-in, where I fly in the presidents and chancellors from all the HBCUs around America, and I team with a few of the CBC members to put that together. So they have they've joined the celebration in ways, and we've had other legislative victories. The anti-lynching bill was two CBC members and myself working together as well. So we found ways to do it, but it's painful. I mean, sometimes it's just, you do what you do because you think it's the right thing to do, and ultimately, long term, if we can't figure out how to be one American family, nothing else will matter.
And talking about being one American family, after Charlottesville, when you went to visit President Donald Trump after he made the remarks that there were fine people on both sides, you said that you don't believe that he's a racist, but that he's racially insensitive, and that his moral authority had been compromised by those comments. And you've also just said that many Republicans maybe are coming at race from a different angle, and that their upbringing has meant that they can't see things maybe as clearly as you do and other people do. Do you think that that's an appropriate excuse for the President of the United States of America? And do you think that his age or his upbringing means that he can be ignorant and make remarks that perhaps portray him to be racially insensitive or indeed racist to many people?
Yeah, I won't pretend to be able to look into anyone's soul or into their hearts to figure out what they mean when they say what they say. I can just tell you that whether you're a Republican or Democrat, this goes on both sides of the aisle. There's people have I have blinders. I mean, I am an African American over 50 years old. I knew that I was only 30, but over 50 years old. It ain't that funny. Anyways, raised in the Deep South, so I see race a lot, and sometimes I'm wrong. Typically I'm not, but sometimes I'm wrong. So, I give everybody the benefit of the doubt, and if that's a problem, I'm okay with it. I mean, ultimately, if I can find a way to work with someone, frankly anyone, on behalf of the people that I represent, count me in. So people can say things that are racially insensitive. People can say things that are challenging. If I disagree with y'all, I'm going to let you know, and sometimes I'll do it publicly. But in the end, the people that I serve do not benefit from me casting aspersions or coming to conclusions about who someone is. I don't find that to be helpful.
But when you visited President Trump, obviously that was in part an educational visit. You went to talk to him about your feelings on that matter.
Yes.
Do you think that people that are achieving higher office within the United States have a responsibility to educate themselves about those issues? Why should you have to go and do that?
Well, I think it's important for someone to take the time and call you in. When President of the United States doesn't have to call anybody in. I mean, whether you love him or not, the bottom line is that I thought that said something about his character, that he was willing to at least have that conversation. I didn't leave excited about the fact that we were not on the same page. I did leave thankful that we had the conversation and we found an area of agreement that we could work on. And frankly, because of that conversation, I've probably been back more than a dozen times talking about other substantive issues that I probably would not have been brought back had I not used that time wisely. So advocating on behalf of the people that I want to see progress happen has been critical to have the president's support. I'm glad that he's been helpful in those areas. But yeah, I think anytime I find myself in a position where no one else will say it, I probably will. If everybody else is saying it, I probably won't.
And regardless of sort of what you think or other people in the Republican Party might think, recent polls have shown that about 54% of Americans perceive Trump to be racist, and that about 84% of African Americans perceive him to be racist. Do you think that it is possible to engage those minority communities when you're allying with the people that they mistrust, like President Trump?
Is it possible for me?
Is it possible, yeah, for you?
I think the answer is yeah. So I mean, if you look at my polling numbers, my approval rates among African Americans in South Carolina, which counts a lot, by the way, is in the 40% range. So I think that my ability to stand up and be counted, even in opposition of some of the comments that may be made, and at the same time advocate on behalf of policies that are incredibly helpful, lets people see me transparently. So I think Spencer and I was having this conversation, I'm a bit of a unicorn. I mean, if you want to see a living, breathing unicorn, a black Republican is about as close as you're going to get on earth. And so it's a fine line to walk at times, but one that I won't say I'm comfortable walking, but it is necessary to walk. So I just do what I do.
Do you think if you'd have queued up and the Democrats had been more keen to take you and more supportive, you'd have been more comfortable in that party?
No, actually, I think philosophically I'm disjointed, disconnected from most people in the Democrat Party. I think I am certainly philosophically aligned with the Republican Party, and sometimes I have to do the uncomfortable because no one else is going to do it. But interesting, I'll say this, which is really kind of a fascinating experience. So a few months ago, after I was unhappy with another federal judge that was going to be nominated, one of my Republican colleagues said, he's an older fellow in his 70s, which means he's the average age in the Senate, by the way. They call me young, which is kind of cool, you know. He said, you know, I'm sick and tired of you having to be the guy that blocks stupidity. I was like, thank you, Lord. I'm just glad to hear that. And he said, you know, when this happens next time, let me take the lead. Provide me the information, and we'll do this together. And then with the recent election, 2 more folks have come on board and acknowledged that they've seen me walking that tightrope, which they thought seemed I was walking it alone, and they've decided to join on board as well. So that's, you know, 3 plus me is 4, and a 53 body, it's helpful.
And you said that you're seen as relatively young in the Senate.
Yes.
Going forward, do you think that you'll ever aspire to higher elected office? Do you think that's a possibility for the rest of your career?
Well, I may run for the presidency of my homeowner association. Does that count?
That's not what I mean.
Oh, okay. Wow. So, yeah, you know, it's hard to judge the future, to be honest with you. I've always said, do all that you can where you are, and let, you know, the good Lord, or other people would say fate, take care of itself. I actually don't have any plans to run for president. I think it's important to be committed where you are. And this has not been the most fun journey. I mean, this has been meaningful beyond imagination, painful without question. So I'll have to see what's in store.
Thank you.
Yes, ma'am.
I think we can move to audience question now. If you'd like a question, please just raise your hand and the mic will come to you. Could we go to the back?
Hi, Senator. Thank you so much for being here. I was wondering if you could speak a little bit to the conversations that are happening right now within the Republican Party in D.C. in the wake of the abortion bills that are being passed in states like Alabama and Ohio.
I think Can I just say no? So, yes. The answer is no. You cannot say no. Okay. So I think the Supreme Court's going to have to make a decision at some point. I think they dodged a bullet, as we just saw in the last 24, 48 hours of the role of the Indiana abortion law. I do think that every bill that we've really voted on in my lifetime, in the Senate, State House, I believe, and Congress as well, has always had 3 exceptions. I think, I'm not sure what the UK law is. I think it's 24 weeks if I read it correctly, assuming that this question was going to come up. Is that right? So 24 weeks is the point where you can no longer have an abortion in this country. Our country, my country, we don't have that standard. We're one of like 7 countries in the world out of 192 that allows for late-term abortions as well. I think if we started the conversation there and worked our way back, we all believe in science as it relates to the environment. I think we ought to believe in science as it relates to the paying capabilities of a fetus. So I'm around the 20-week periods where we are now. I think that number will change and get smaller as the years go further. But as it relates to the states doing what they're doing, that's all going to head to the Supreme Court. If I had to guess, I would imagine that we'll end up with what we have now, which is a national standard without Congress's ability to move forward even on what I think is a common sense piece of legislation, which is the capable legislation of 20 weeks. I don't think we'll see a lot of progress happen on the issue for some time to come, but we may be on 2 different sides of the issue, but I think we're going to see it stall in the Supreme Court immediately, and I think it was Justice Thomas who said that you cannot avoid this fight inevitably, so that acknowledges the fact that the Supreme Court will be in a position to make this decision at some point in the future. I don't know when that happens. I think it happens sooner than later. There are going to be more stays on state laws, and that will lead through the court system, and at some point it will be taken up. From a federal perspective, I don't assume that there will be any changes unless we the right, the Conservative Party wins a gazillion seats, which I'm not sure that we have a gazillion seats to win, but my party's divided on the issue, not as much as the Democrats are solidified on the issue, but we're sufficiently divided enough that there won't be a lot of movement coming anytime soon.
Go to the hand at the front.
Hi, thank you again for being here, Senator. I want to push back a little bit on some of the information you were sharing about the tax cut bill.
Sure.
A report just came out from the Congressional Research Service that said that we're actually only 5% of the way. One of the ways that the bill was sold to the American public was that it would pay for itself in economic growth, capital investment, different things. And the report from the Congressional Research Service said that we're only 5% of the way there for paying for it, which is way off track from where we should be. And if you're talking about the national debt and $22 trillion, this bill added trillions to the national debt. And also, I think kind of my biggest problem with the bill was the way that most of the gains that we've seen have actually gone to the 1% and to the wealthiest Americans, rather than the average person. I think it was case in point when you said that 48% of Americans only have $400 in the bank for an emergency, which is true, and you said we could double that. But that's still only $800, which isn't enough for a lot of emergencies in the United States. And I think that when you talk about opportunity and giving people opportunity in America, things that exacerbate the already massive inequality gaps that we have in our country are not going to be giving people more opportunity. They're going to be taking resources away from things like education and community block grants and other things that the government can do to sort of bring that opportunity back. And I think that this tax cut bill doesn't provide any more opportunity than a progressive tax cut that takes money from the richest and gives it back to the rest of the American people would. So I just would like to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah. Let's just say I fundamentally disagree with the premise of the question. You assumed that, right? Good. So if you look at a state like California, young ladies from California, they have one of the reasons why they have a $21 billion surplus this year. has been attributed to the tax reform bill that has higher waged people paying a higher percentage of the taxes. So when you look at the fact, and part of your point is true. So the top 2%, I think it is, maybe it's 1.7%, whatever it is, top 2% make about 20% of the income in America. They pay about 40% of the taxes. That number has gone up because of the tax reform. So what we've seen under tax reform bills of the past, President Obama raised taxes, and from the places where the taxes went up, the revenues to the government went down. John F. Kennedy, President Kennedy, actually cut taxes because he thought that was kind of a cool concept as well. And where he cut the taxes, the revenues actually went up. Same was true with Bush, W. Same was true with Reagan. Same was true in the 1930s when taxes were cut. Then, unfortunately, what's happened on all occasions as spending has gone up. So under the current tax reform bill, what you'll find, which makes a lot of sense from a business perspective, is that on the front end is where you get the benefits of the depreciation schedules and the write-offs from a business perspective. So those write-offs are on paper, they matter a lot, but those are write-offs that the benefit happens in years 4 through 10. So the fact that we're getting more revenue now is an anomaly according to most economists. I will tell you that CBO, our wonderful folks, said that this tax bill was going to create a huge $1 trillion plus hole, when in fact revenues are already coming up, not going down like they predicted. So the math is off on that number. Now, if we continue to do what we've done, not only bring more money into the Treasury, but if we continue to grow our economy over 2.4%, $1 trillion for every 0.4, $700 billion, so 0.6 is $1 trillion. So if you can keep it at 3.1, 3.2, you start seeing real dollars to deal with your national debt. Everything else that we've seen from a tax increase standpoint has actually constrained the revenues to the government. And we did try that just recently, and the numbers are easily found. Someone could actually find them right now if they want to. So.
Can we go to the hand? Yeah, with the blue shirt. Yeah, you.
Thank you for being here, Senator, and I love your socks.
Oh, thank you, Ryan.
They're incredible.
Appreciate that.
So I spent the past 5 months going to all 50 states in the USA,
Yes,
talking to mayors, including Knox White in Greenville, South Carolina,
Yes.
and Mayor Benjamin, and also regular folks about what they're concerned about. And I feel like there's a massive lack of interest in dissecting Donald Trump's character, but there is a huge interest in the policies that are being passed. And so I guess you said that it's time now that we are making these surpluses to invest in either paying down the debt or in maybe social policies. What do you think when you hear someone like Elizabeth Warren say, okay, all incomes over $50 million, we're going to pay 2 cents on the dollar to help pay for programs to help with student debt or childcare? Is that something that you think the Republicans could maybe work with Democrats on in the future?
You want a short answer or a long answer, Ryan?
I want the long answer.
Oh, good. Short answer is nah. So, no, it's the short answer. I won't give that to you. Once upon a time, there's a senator from Massachusetts named Elizabeth Warren, who's a smart woman, wanted to be the head of the CFPB. Perhaps we should have let her be the head of the CFPB, by the way. Okay. So there is a movement around centralized control, which is what most of the Democratic candidates are striving for right now. And then there's those of us on the right who still want that Adam Smith concept of the invisible hand, where 330 million Americans have some participation or some investment in this thing called the American or the democratic form of capitalism. What happens is that the question you ask is, would we reverse our path and decide to increase taxes, which we believe, at least I believe, actually reduces revenues and makes it harder for us to create jobs? So that's where I am. So you're asking me to do something that I think is antithetical to the goal of helping the people who are the least of these within our society. I have come from those neighborhoods. I've studied the tax rates from the last 30 years. And the one thing I clearly conclude is that lower taxes actually increases revenues typically improves employment opportunities and can, not always, but can lead to wage growth that we desperately need. So whether it's the 2% or 4% version of the wealth tax, which, by the way, wherever they say it starts, history proves that, the millionaires and billionaires under the Obama administration started at $250,000 of income. So that's not my definition of a millionaire or billionaire. So the 70% income tax, the 4% wealth tax, the 2% wealth tax, the tax on unrealized capital gains, which is a part of that journey on wealth tax, basically says that even if you don't get the benefit, you got to pay the taxes. Now, this is not new news, of course. This is something that we struggled with under the previous administration when President Obama flirted with a tax on unrealized gain when it passed down, so the inheritance tax. They would actually tax the unrealized gain, but they would allow you to go take a loan out for 15 years to actually pay that debt to the government. I think we have to be very careful when we start talking about taxing wealth as a way of creating a revenue stream to pay for a program. We do have about $4 trillion to figure out how to pay for programs if we thought that they were important enough to pay for. What we haven't had the courage to do, from my perspective, is to look at functional consolidation of programs that are unnecessary so that we can free up those revenues to go to other folks or other places that need the money more. We could do that in significant ways and get the same benefit as a 2% wealth tax. The other thing is that anytime we actually think that we can create a system that is punitive in the private sector, we typically close off the door to some opportunities. So in other words, instead of those folks reinvesting that gain or realizing that gain, we see that gain sit on the sidelines until the tax environment is favorable. It's one of the reasons why when we saw the capital gains tax, it may be under Clinton, I'm not sure, it's Clinton or Bush, I can't remember, went down from 20% to 15%. We saw the revenues of the government go from $469 to $700 billion with that lower tax rate because it created incentive. Now that incentive, and just to be fair, doesn't work everywhere. It works when you have the ability to make the decision to pay it now or pay it later. So an income tax doesn't work quite the same, if that makes sense, because if you go to work, you're going to pay the tax. Now, if you're above a certain threshold, you actually don't have to go to work. So you don't have to make the money. You just make the profit. So there's a lot of scenarios. If you just follow it out, what you find out pretty quickly is the people at the top have more ways to avoid that taxation. So a lower tax actually creates more incentive for them to participate now. So that's one of the reasons why we're getting more revenues, but it's also the reason why we're creating more jobs, is because we've created an incentive for those folks that have the capital to go out and create more opportunity, more jobs. And it's working now. If it doesn't work, then I'd say let's revisit it, but right now it's working. Sorry for that. If that was too long, I apologize. But okay.
Can we go to the hand? Yeah, in the purple jumper.
Thank you, Senator. Could you say something about how you balance your political life and your business endeavors?
Yes. The way I balance it has been pretty easy, to be honest with you. I sold them. That's the short answer. I can give you the long answer too, by the way. Sure. Okay, no, I'm just joking. So I just sold them. I mean, at the end of the day, here's what I believe. I mean, I'm not perfect and will never be. I recognize that if I'm still involved in the insurance business and a real estate business, I have a fiduciary responsibility. Thankfully, the federal government agrees with me that a fiduciary responsibility is a bit of a challenge. Now, you can put it into a blind trust and probably get away with it, but to me, it's kind of like smoke and mirrors. I'm not quite sure I actually believe in that, and someone else is going to have a question on other people who probably should do that too. I won't have a good answer for them. I only have an answer for me. So I think you should sell it. So I sold it. I sold it all. I own nothing other than interest in real estate as a passive investor. I have no actual businesses left. I think it makes me more authentic in my pursuit of my ends, of my means to the end, my ends. Yeah.
Yeah, can we go to the hand in the white top?
Thank you so much for coming today.
Yes, sir.
I have a quick question. Well, first, I want to commend you so much on the passage of the Opportunity Act.
Thank you, sir.
And I was reading a book by Senator Flake, The Conscience of a Conservative.
Next question. We have no conscience. That's a joke for TV. Okay, go ahead.
But in this book, he talks about how, I guess, parties vote together very often, and often not towards the conscience of the individual person. So I was wondering, well, if you agree with that, maybe like on occasion, but also if you do agree with that, what would have to change within the environment of the American political system for politicians in general to vote their conscience rather than their party?
Yeah, so I would say that Senator Flake makes a good point in that the herd mentality is alive and well everywhere. But the truth of the matter is that you come down on one or the other side. When legislation is crafted, it's either going to be more like you want it or less like you want it. So if it's more like you want it, it's probably going to be because you were drafting the legislation. And most of the folks who are on that side that's drafting the legislation says it's more like I want it, so I'm going to vote for it. Folks on the other side are going to say it's not exactly as I wanted it, so I'm going to vote against it. So a part of why people vote in within the herds is because there's more Republican stuff in that legislation than not. There's more Democrat stuff in that legislation than not. So that's how come people vote in the herds. I would say that most people do find the way to vote their conscience. I would say whether you're Republican or Democrat, if you believe that the legislation has more good than bad, you're probably going to vote for it. Now, there's a purity test in your voting as well. So if it's not 100% of what you want, some people actually vote against it. Chances of you getting 100% of what you want in a body of 100 members is very low. So there are folks who vote against legislation, left or right, all the time. So there is a herd mentality, but it's not because people aren't voting their conscience. It's more so because the legislation represents most of what they want, even though some of what they don't want is in there as well. But that's in my opinion, the difference or the delineation between common ground and compromise. Trying to find yourself on the right side of that argument is hard and important.
Can we go to the pink shirt?
Thank you, Senator. I just wanted to quickly go back to your answer to the abortion question, not to discuss the substance of it, but you seemed oddly okay with allowing the Supreme Court to answer that question. Now, as you know, the Constitution and its non-delegation doctrine is pretty clear about all legislative powers going to your body, and of course, the rise of the administrative state. And we're seeing issues like that with the Chevron deference and Gundy versus the United States right now. I was wondering what you thought your responsibility is as a legislature to try and bring back that power to you from the executive and even the judicial branches.
Yeah, I would say that I'm not sure if I'm comfortable or uncomfortable with the Supreme Court making a decision when there are conflicts within the states where one state has a law that says 8 weeks, another state has a law that says 10 weeks. Some states have laws that say that there are exceptions, at least a state or two have laws that say that there's only one exception. The federal law says that there are 3 exceptions. So the number of pieces, the legislation that we have tried to get through on the 20-week bill have failed. Every single piece of legislation has failed. So there is not a means of getting it changed on the federal level. Therefore, if the states are in conflict, there's only one place for that to be resolved, which is the Supreme Court.
I think we have time for one more question.
I should have talked longer, I apologize.
Yeah, can we go to the hand just up?
Thank you, Senator. Thank you. I was very pleased to hear some of your experience, in particular what you went through, your learning about capitalism, the importance you place on education. I wanted to know if you could shed some light. What sort of capitalism you have actually learned? Is it democratic capitalism or barbaric capitalism? Democratic capitalism being one where a lot of interest at play, and barbaric that benefit, the usual kind of people. And also, in your legislative experience, how do you strike a balance? How you manage the various interests, in such a way that you be able to have an end result that actually benefit the underprivileged group. And in particular, I'm talking here about, the African American. You mentioned about some unemployment rate being very low, but I think that's just a figure, which it's just a national figure. How does it translate to communities like the African American, the Spaniard, and so on?
So, easy question. I like multiple choice, so thank you very much. I'll take the one, I think it was A for conscientious capitalism and not, well, I'm going to change it. I heard what he said, yeah. I'll change it to conscientious capitalism and not barbaric, which I assume isn't capitalism at all, it's just greed. I think there is a delineation between greed and capitalism. We don't necessarily have time to go through that, but I just go with conscientious capitalism. Perhaps the best example of your definition of democratic capitalism was when I was in Israel in 2012, meeting with a rabbi on the Sabbath, and he was talking about the democratic form of capitalism that he was inspired by in America, and went through the tenets, the founding principles that grounded the pursuit of profit, because the pursuit of good was as important as the pursuit of profit. And so I assume that's what you're talking about, and he did a wonderful job, and I can't do what he did, but I can say I agreed with him, and I agreed that the conscience of the capitalist matters a lot. And that's one of the reasons why in my Opportunity Zone legislation, I've worked very hard to make sure that I attract people to the table who don't want to take advantage of communities, but who want to invest in communities. And it's one of the reasons why the legislation requires a long-term, up to a 7-year investment in order to get people anchored in, not just a running gun, so to speak, to get in and get out. The answer to the second question may be a little easier from my perspective. How do I make sure that I remember the least of these, or the African American community, as you said specifically, and in this Hispanic community in my pursuits? I actually do my best to think more about people who are in and who are out, not people who are black or who are white. So, my worldview is one that if I was 5 years older, I would have grown up in South Carolina when schools were still segregated, but I wasn't. I was born in a time when I may have been the only black kid in a couple of my classes, but I was born in a time where my worldview is just one of an integrated society, and I like it. And I want to make sure that I push that forward. So I think about people who have and people who don't. And so in that, from that vantage point, I will answer the question. As a kid who was on the out and who didn't have, I fundamentally formed the very foundation of the things I pursue, whether that was the tax reform or the opportunity zones, whether it was the criminal justice reform that I was one of the lead sponsors on the Republican side that the president signed into. It was the first time in 40 years that we have transformed the way that we see the folks who are incarcerated, and when they're coming out, it substantially improves the likelihood that the folks who are coming out will not recidivate. The current number is 77% recidivate within 5 years. They end up back in prison. In South Carolina, that number is about 23%. Our goal is to follow those states who have been able to bend the curve down significantly. So we're going to continue to do that. On legislation that impacts people who have rare diseases like sickle cell, we passed this past year legislation that will help folks with rare diseases, including sickle cell. We had a hearing where folks who are working on CRISPR technology and other forms of actually curing the disease for the first time in 40 years. I worked on legislation in the Farm Bill that helped black farmers who had, disproportionately black farmers have heirs property where they can't use the property because there's no title to it in order to get a loan to be able to monetize the value of that land. They now can get a Farm Bill which allows them to apply for programs within the government. I've worked on the Credit Scoring Competition Act, which was signed into law as part of the bank reform that happened last year with the support of 17 Democrats. That allows for us to use as a part of your credit worthiness, whether or not you're paying your rent on time, your electric bill on time, your phone bill on time, which they are not used, so that we can actually increase the number of folks who are banked and the number of folks who are eligible for home loans. If you're talking about the disparity between those who do have and those who do not have, or the wealth gap, a home and the equity in the home is the biggest asset of Americans. African American home ownership, 44%, white ownership, 77%. Close that gap, you change the dynamics as well. So there are dozens of pieces of legislation that I can point to that help those who do not have, whether you're black, whether you're white, whether you're Hispanic. My focus is if I can close that gap, my country functions like a family easier.
Senator, thank you so much for coming to talk to us today. Can everyone join me in thanking Senator Tim Scott?